Salam. This is going to be chapter 5 in our reading of the Black Jews of Africa, History, Religion, Identity. The name of this chapter is Blacks and Jews, the Archetypal Others. And in this particular chapter, we're going to be journeying into the mind of early white supremacy and how it shaped and molded a lot of the views of the Bible in the Western world and other parts of the world. So let's get into this. Otherness. The extensive travel accounts written by Hakluyt, Purchas, and Pinkerton in the 17th and 18th centuries, and the more intimate adventure stories of the 19th century's travel literature both brought focus to a broadened European ethnological knowledge. From the 17th century, travel literature presented native peoples in strange countries as both objects of conquest and subjects of representation. Their discovery and invention reinforced and perhaps established the notion of Europe by focusing on it and surrounding it with a strange periphery. As Mary L. Pratt put it, each portrait of manners and customs contributed to the formation of a normalizing discourse intended to fix the other in a timeless present. The multiplication of travel accounts and their circulation among different European readerships gave rise to what has been named a planetary conscience. The creation of Western identity was constructed in a certain way in opposition or relation to these others. Susan Zantop has described how the Europeans, when absorbing the newly discovered lands in America, Africa, and the Pacific, both shaped and distorted to their liking the image of the other. She wrote, "The connections between the other there and the over here, between the colony and home, the other and the self are of course at the heart of all colonial fantasies. The other is not just out there, but forms an integral part of the self and its perception. What concerns us in particular is the encounter between European and non-European that lies at the heart of the questions of difference and otherness. While Michael Foucault proposed that the human sciences of life, work, and language produced a European ego that served as a universal reference for man, Edward Said analyzed the complex and subtle ways through which European subjectivity was confirmed and reinforced at the cost of the conquest, domination, and objectification of a world of colonized others. Both Foucault and Said concluded that a discourse produced by various representational practices, academic studies, exhibitions, literature, and paintings constitutes a form of racialized knowledge of the other. Orientalism said. Orientalism for Said. An anthropological approach argues that the marketing of difference is the basis for the symbolic order that we call culture. Mary Douglas, in referring to the work carried out by the sociologist Emile Durkheim on symbolic systems, and to subsequent studies carried out on myths by the anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss, tells us that social groups impose meaning on the world by classifying and organizing things within binary classification systems. Paradoxically, however, this places more importance on difference and renders it surprisingly attractive, precisely because it is forbidden, taboo, and because it threatens one's cultural order. A more recent approach of Anne McClintock and Robert Young used a psychoanalytical terminology for analyzing the social political imagination of the colonies, adding that sexuality played a crucial role in the shaping of difference in colonial fantasies. The European attempt to articulate these new others became a key part of the colonial discourse. Prejudices, beliefs, and ideologies converged to describe the primitive within the scope of Western experience, establishing a vital connection between Christianity and Western culture as a whole. In a number of cases, the distinction between explorers, missionaries, and agents of the colonial development was blurred. The orthodox missionary discourse was supposed to be in harmony with the prospects of the political and cultural colonization of the empires. On behalf of the Dutch East India Company, which had just established trading posts in Southern Africa in 1652, John van Riebeek proclaimed a colonial mission in which the name of Christ may be extended. The interest of the company promoted. Similarly, the Virginia Company, created in 1607 for the colonization of North America, declared, Our primary end is to plant religion. Our secondary and subalternate ends are for the honor and profit of our nation. Anthony Christopher noted rightly that missionaries, possibly more than members of other branches of the colonial establishment, aimed at the radical transformation of indigenous society. They therefore sought, whether consciously or unconsciously, the destruction of pre-colonial societies and the replacement by new Christian societies in the image of Europe. In order to avoid a far too linear history of ideas, I wish to make it clear that as the missionary strategies emanated from a very diverse Europe, they continued contradictory and divergent myths that were only slowly aggregated to give form to the unknown other. However, many 18th century explorers, 19th century missionaries, and 20th century colonists used the same signs and symbols in their speech and acted in accordance with them. They generated in ethnological knowledge through their regular contact with local customs by adopting the missionaries' theory of history, which assumed that the language and culture of the savages would disappear with the implantation of Christian civilization. In Orientalism, 1978, Edward Said alluded to the battery of the desires, repressions, investments, and projections that conspire with the economic interest to the production of colonial mentalities. Valentin Mudimbe, in order to define the development of discourse that came to be applied to Africa, used Frobenius's term African Genesis, 1937, to formulate his hypothesis about the epistemological locus of the African's invention and its meaning for discourses on Africans. This should not imply that the Western inventors of an African Genesis did not distinguish the different levels and types of interpretations of Africa. The internalizing of these myriads others through multiculturalism and increased mobility can be seen as heralding European modernity. Medieval Christendom had known only two main kinds of others, Jews and Moors, who personified two aspects of a little developed, even bestial and degenerated humanity. The Greek term Maori, was used at the time as both a poetical equivalent of Ethiops and a broad term that included black Africans. As Parfit wrote, the archetypal others of Europe, the essential religious and racial others, the Moor, who were originally black, are black, the Moor and the Jew, originally black, as we know, whose relationship with Christian Europe had been forged from long centuries of religious and military conflict, were pressed into service. The immediate boundary between Christian and Jew or Moor was endlessly duplicated as Europe confronted the hitherto unknown parts of the world. The two main vectors of the classification of the unknown other were religion and racialism, which were often inextricably intertwined. From Genesis to phylogenesis, the issue remains the same, even though it reflects the various social and scientific forms taken in the West over the centuries, and can be summarized as follows. It is the nature of the other and the study of his similarities and dissimilarities that enable me to determine the proximity of his race to mine. The transformation that took place between the 16th and 18th centuries, as nation states asserted themselves in Europe, not only led to the conquering colonial enterprise, but also constituted the transition from biblical to racial theories. In other words, from the nearly intact heritage of medieval Christianity to the notions that gave birth to race theories. One of the most crucial questions of the time was the unity of mankind, or monogenism, as opposed to the separate creation of races, or polygonism. At the end of the 18th century, two views coexisted about Africans. The first one was that they were the result of degeneration. You see how they flip it? How they make it seem like if like white came from black when it was the other way around. Due to different environmental conditions. The second, the more widespread, was that they were a separate creation with subhuman characteristics. In the 18th century, by asking questions about the situation of Negroes compared with white men and apes, some Europeans, in the name of science, broke away from Adamic unity, while others re-emphasized the unity of mankind. The representation of difference through the body became the discursive site through which most of this racialized knowledge was produced and circulated. In fact, each of the major theoretical options specific to these periods has remained alive, each new option added to the former instead of replacing them. David Green discussed these views in relation to anthropology and ethnology, the disciplines that offered the most scientific data in that respect at the time. At the position and status of the inferior races became increasingly to be regarded as fixed. So socio-cultural differences came to be regarded as dependent upon hereditary characteristics. Since these were inaccessible to direct observation, they had to be inferred from physical and behavioral traits, which, in turn, they were intended to explain. Sociocultural differences among human populations became subsumed within the identity of the individual body. In an attempt to trace the line of determination between the biological and social, the body became the totemic object and its very visibility the evident articulation of nature and culture. The set of views opinions, beliefs, and attitudes regarding Africans and how they have been perceived has a long and complex development. Long held and often unconscious associations preempted the encounter between parties involved in colonization and Africans. The assumed inferiority of black Africans, to which the myth of the lost tribes and its byproduct in part contributed, was an essential characteristic of colonial discourse throughout the long period of colonial empires, from the West conquest to the beginning of the 20th century. As the history of Western perceptions of Africans has many contributors, so it would seem that African Jews are also the inheritors of a long accumulating history. The propensity to identify racial features common to Africans and Jews extended back to ancient times through continuities and discontinuities, through an amalgam of projections. Similar traits were attributed to the groups, including skin color and correlated characteristics. Surreptitious links between blackness and Jewishness were formed during the Middle Ages in Western society. A study of perceptions, symbolic associations, and ramifications will explore how dark-skinned people were perceived from ancient times, how negative associations attached to the color black were played out on the stage of history, and how connections between skin tone and Jewishness became embedded in Western culture. In this process, history and exegesis are intimately related with psychological projection, and the exegetical mirror provides a lens to focus on cultural needs. The blacks as sinners. Frantz Fanon summarized the attitude of the West toward blackness. In Europe, the black man is the symbol of evil. The torturer is the black man. Satan is black. One talks of shadows when one is dirty, one is black. Whether one is thinking of physical dirtiness or moral dirtiness, it would be astonishing if the trouble were taken to bring all together to see the vast number of expressions that make the black man the equivalent of sin. In Europe, whether concretely or symbolically, the black man stands for the bad side of character. As long as one cannot understand this fact, one is doomed to talk in circles about the black problem. Blackness, darkness, shadow, shades, nights, the labyrinths of the earth, abysmal depths blackens someone's reputation, and on the other side, the bright look of innocence, the white dove of peace, magical heavenly light, blah. Interestingly, in biblical scriptures, most references to Africans, for example, Cushim, are descriptive and non-judgmental. The area south of Egypt, descending into Central Africa and extending east to the Red Sea, was known to the ancient Near Eastern cultures as Cush in the Hebrew Bible, while in Greek writings, the name for this land was Ethiopia. We also find the word Nubians in earlier sources such as Isaiah chapter 20 verses 4 through 6. And in time, it came to indicate the originally African ethnic element of the Ethiopian population. The inhabitants of Cush are frequently placed in a positive context as brave fighters, or they are merchants. And Cush is described as a land of precious stones. In the Bible, the many references to Cushim may be divided into two literal and metaphorical types. Ethnic origins in the genealogy of Noah's sons offspring in Genesis 10. Place, Cush is defined as a land lying south of Egypt. Ezekiel 29:10, a metaphor for a faraway place at the ends of the earth. Esther chapter 12, 1, and Esther chapter 8, verse 9, and a metaphor for another human situation referring to the black-skinned person designated as other. The word Ham, which in the history of ideas came to define Africans, appears for the first time in Genesis. In the Bible, Ham found Noah drunk and naked in Noah's tent. He told his brothers, Shem and Japheth, who covered the nakedness of their father, their faces turned away. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he cursed Ham's son Canaan, saying, "Cursed be Canaan, a slave of slaves shall he be to his brothers." Genesis chapter 9, verses 18 through 25. Some scholars have focused on the question whether Jews, Christians, or Muslims first connected the curse with black skin color, which is false. And it is a strange association indeed, for there is no reference in it to blacks at all. Some of them claim that this tradition grew out of a need of the Israelites to rationalize the dispossession of the Canaanite pre-Israelite population. Others argue that the interpretation of this verse was the cause of black enslavement for centuries. Melachmed comments, the identification of Ham and his sons as dark-skinned and naturally destined to slavery is post-biblical, the result of later historical and cultural circumstances, and is by no means to be projected anachronistically onto the Bible itself. Many centuries later, in the 6th century AD, the Babylonian Talmud mentions that Ham, having supposedly emasculated Noah, was thus cursed and condemned to be black. Ham is described as a sinner and his progeny as degenerated, with negative moral and physical attributes. Now I cannot beget the fourth son whose children I would have ordered to serve you and your brothers. Therefore it must be Canaan, your firstborn, whom they enslave. And since you have disabled me, doing ugly things in the blackness of night, Canaan's children shall be born ugly and black. Yeah. Moreover, because you twisted your head around to see my nakedness, your grandchildren's hair shall be twisted into kinks, and their eyes red. Again, because your lips jested at my misfortune, there shall swell. And because you neglected my nakedness, they shall go naked, and their male member shall be shamefully elongated. Excuse me. Men of this race are called Negroes. Their forefather Canaan commanded them to love theft and fornication, to be banded together in hatred of their masters, and never to tell the truth. Okay. Thus, from time immemorial, Africans have been considered to be the descendants of Ham, carrying the stigmatism of Noah's curse, occupying a prescribed and inescapable place in biblical history. The interpretations of the Talmud and the Midrash of the curse of Ham were well known by Jewish authors in the Middle Ages, as evidenced in the following description of the south of Aswan by Benjamin of Tudela, the 12th century merchant and explorer. There is a people There's a people who, like animals, eat the earth that grows on the banks of the Nile and in their fields. They go about naked and have not the intelligence of ordinary men. They cohabit with their sisters and anyone they can find. They are taken as slaves and sold in Egypt and neighboring countries. These sons of Ham are black slaves. Frank Snowden analyzed antiquity's heritage concerning the basis of the relationship between Africans and racialism in order to understand how medieval Christians treated it. Even if he concluded with certain optimism that from an ideological point of view, antiquity and early Christianity did not demonstrate any notions of racial inequality toward Africans, it is difficult to deny that elements of a white supremacy existed. Of a white supremacy existed. Early Greek culture and the Roman culture that followed it saw a link between physical beauty and moral perfection. Roman culture developed an entire science, physiognomy, on this basis and attempted to fit physical characteristics of the face and the body to spiritual characteristics. A representation designating dirt and sin came as a result of aesthetic norms and values to mean dark color and to designate the black person. The Latin word sordis, which indicates baseness, later came to signify a dark complexion. In later Hellenistic Roman culture, ambiguous and even negative expressions made their appearance. On a basis of climate theory, the Romans assumed that the inferior psychophysical traits of the Africans in the South arose from harsh geographical and climatic surroundings. In early Christianity, light played a large role in the scriptures. Jesus is the light of the world. John chapter 8, verses 12, and John chapter 9, verse 5, and his absence was associated with darkness. A clear tendency toward negative value judgments about Africans and about anyone whose skin was significantly darker than the norm emerged only slowly. In the black horse presented in Revelation chapter 6, verse 5, Jerome Cesare of Arles, and Bede or Bede immediately saw the symbol of a damned people. Christian medieval iconography often juxtaposed the contrast between the black front of the synagogue and the white one of the church. Similarly, all exegesis concerning verse 5:11 of the Song of Songs gives unfavorable treatment to the color black plausibly because of the accepted standards of beauty in Jerome's time. Black appears as a metaphor for paganism, while comely is a metaphor for becoming a Christian. That is, choosing to do well in the verse. I am black but comely, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of Kedar, as the curtains of Solomon. Look not upon me because I am black, because the sun hath looked upon me. Song of Solomon, chapter 1, verses 5-6. Paradoxically, as early as the Exodus around the 13th century BC, an episode in the Bible mentioned that God condemned Miriam. Okay, and when I continue to read this, she's reading this from the context of how the rewritten versions were played out. Okay, from the context of more of like a white supremacist outlook on the Bible. Okay, so let me begin from here once again. Paradoxically, as early as the Exodus around the 13th century BC, an episode in the Bible mentioned that God condemned Miriam, Moses' sister, by inflicting on her a leopard as white as snow, as in Numbers chapter 12, verse 10, for having criticized her brother who had married a dark-skinned woman. We already know that the Hebrews, the Jews, and the Ethiopians are people, one and the same. So this is just the whitewashed context. The sin was criticizing something concerning Moses' black wife, and the punishment was whitening the skin of the sinner, in contradiction to all stereotypes. In the first century, the Hellenized Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, circa 20 BC to AD 50, was the first writer to attempt an allegorical interpretation of the biblical characters. Following Philo in the 3rd century AD, Origen professed an interpretation that made a major contribution to skin color significance. Without abandoning the traditional significance of the color black, he transposed the entire issue of the spiritual domain. Blackness is not a flaw that is passively received or endured, but rather a feature that one acquires and for which one is responsible. Therefore, Origen assimilated blackness to Jews and pagans, which he de-dramatized the physical question of skin tone. Other Latin fathers, such as Augustine and Ambrose, also took inspiration from allegory. Origen had conceived about the Africans and created in his wake a typology for the subsequent ecclesiastical writers. To varying degrees, all the commentators consider the color black as being linked to sin, which must be washed away in order to return whiteness to the bearer so as to ensure his salvation. Following the same line, chroniclers took up the theme of the curse of Ham's descendants. Ham and the Ethiops were the predestined descendants of Noah devoted to the devil. As descendants of Adam through Noah, they could only have a white ancestor, and therefore they became black through their own doing. The madness of white supremacy. The Christian exegesis combined with popular prejudices wove on this framework a recurring image wherein blackness became the symbol of evil. Fladord in the 10th century speaks very simply about the Ethiopian people, black by sin and body. One of the primary places where the Middle Ages Christian sentiment is evident is in religious iconography. For many centuries, black was the color of the devil or of the executioner. The earliest testimonies known to date of the blackening of demons date to an 8th century fresco in Santa Maria Antica in Rome, which shows Christ trampling a dark character underfoot during his descent into limbo. In an Italian manuscript of the same period conserved in Patmos, one can see traces of black paint on the anthropomorphic body of the demon. Without specifying the exact color, the text of Perpetual's Passion, written during the 2nd century AD by Tertullian, was one of the earliest testimonials of the presence of an African executioner. Since the 16th century, the position of Africans in a universe enlarged by the European expansion was diversified and gave rise to a vision characterized by contradiction and ambivalence, but whose change of tone was obvious. This evolution can be attributed to the impact on attitudes caused by the discovery of America in 1492 and the rounding of the Cape of Good Hope a few years later, which obliged Europe to broaden its concept of the other. A contrasting image of the African developed when a dark-skinned wise man appeared in Europe, Gaspard of Balthazar, depending on legend, which would be followed in the 13th century by Maurice, a more or less legendary saint who became the first incarnation of the West of a sanctified African. But laudatory traditions did not last long and did not carry much weight compared with negative representations. The habit which followed for many centuries with the repetition of stereotypes anchored in medieval society prepared the ground for the notion of cultural dominance that directed the interpretation of Africa and Africans from the discoveries up through the colonial enterprises. Excuse me. The Jews as blacks. You think so? Parfit recalls that Amerigo Vespucci, 1454 to 1512, in trying to define the strangeness of American Indians, only succeeded in doing so by referring to the Jew-Moorish relationship. They can be called neither Moors nor Jews, but worse than Gentiles. Indeed, a long-lasting overlap of images of otherness, the Moor and the Jew, operated in medieval European culture. The imagined Jews, in a way, dichotomized with those who lived in European cities, played a hugely important role in Christian imaginations. From the Middle Ages, Western peoples, when they encountered a crisis of representation due to endogenous conflicts or to exogenous political phenomena, would call up the ambivalence in connection with the notion of the lost tribes. One of the earliest invocation of the Jews as others was with respect to unknown and somewhat threatening populations of Central Asia. For instance, Marco Polo, 1254 to 1324, described a people of excellent warriors, good archers, and good soldiers in battle, and suggested the existence of 10 tribes, kingdoms in the east. In Georgia, there was a king named David Melik, which in French means King David, who is a subject of the Tartar. The legend of faraway lost tribes in Asia imprisoned by Alexander became almost commonplace in medieval literature for various European countries, and over time underwent some interesting transformations. In the Jungerer Titurel, written about 1280, and ascribed to Albert von Scharfenberg, the Red Jews are represented as shut behind mountains called Gog and Magog, according to the peoples of that name. The presence of the 10 tribes in the east was mentioned later on by Geoffrey of Viterbo. Then again in Quilicinus of Spoleto's text of 1236-1238, then in Konung Alexander, which was written in medieval Swedish around 1380, as well as in Rudolf of Ems Alexander, written around the middle of the 13th century. According to these authors, the Jews imprisoned by Alexander were not distinct from Gog and Magog, but in general they were attributed a hard and merciless heart. Judah's evil spirit and red hair. Indeed, people in those days thought that Jews typically had red hair. Wow. From medieval Europe, a system of primordial associations was elaborated that makes out the supposed members of the 10 tribes of Asia by the color of their hair or skin. Black-white symbolism necessarily transferred to social relations. The negative symbolism of the skin tone influenced how the European came to perceive the Jews. In the scriptures, 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 12, and since the Greek times, the harmony attributed to physical features was considered a sign of spiritual harmony. Anyone with alleged different features, the Jew and the African, was necessarily perceived as anesthetic. And that is as not good. As Gilman observes, the very concept of color is a quality of otherness, not of reality. For not only blacks are black in this amorphous world of projection, so too are Jews. The Roman historian Tacitus, in his famous criticism of the Jews and their customs, presents them as wallowing in superstition, sexually promiscuous, idle, and indolent. That is exactly the same characteristics that were assigned to the Africans. What was seen as their physical ugliness, long nose, flat feet, and hairy body, was merely a component of their blackness. As early as the 13th century, an expression of religious and ethnical hostility towards Africans and Jews is represented in the overlap of Jew and black and the representation of Judas' treason, where Judas is black. Ancient writings already mentioned the Jewish appropriation of this self-image. In the Nisahon Vetus, a treatise of the early Middle Ages answering the Christian discourse about the Jews, the author wrote, The heretics ask, why are most Gentiles fair-skinned and handsome, while most Jews are dark and ugly? Answer them about this. Answer them that this is similar to the fruit. When it begins to grow, it is white, but when it ripens, it becomes black. One can respond further that Gentiles are incontinent and have sexual relations during the day, at a time when they see the faces on attractive pictures. Therefore, they give birth to children who look like those pictures. The argument for a degenerative Jewish nature coexisted easily with the belief that the Jews inherited. The argument for a degenerative Jewish nature coexisted easily with the belief that the Jews inherited distinctive personality traits. This view has a long history in European science. Some early Spanish writers of the 17th century were especially fond of arguments that connected racial heritage with behavior. Prudencio de Sandoval asked in 1604, "Who can deny that in the descendants of the Jews there persists and endures the evil inclination of their ancient ingratitude and lack of understanding, just as in Negroes there persists the inseparability of their blackness?" 17th century English travelers renewed the accepted stereotypes of Jewish racial otherness, including the belief that Jews were black-skinned. When William Brereton noted his impressions of the Jews in the synagogue of Amsterdam in 1635, he observed that the Jewish men are most black and insatiably given unto women. Drawing on contemporary prejudices linking blackness and licentiousness, the Scottish minister Robert Kirk, when he paid a visit to a synagogue in London in 1690, observed more than 200 Jews worshiping and noted, "They were all very black men and indistinct in their reasoning as gypsies." This point of view dominated the vision of the Jews so much that Adam G. de Górowski, a Polish nobleman, took every light-colored mulatto for a Jew. By the end of the 17th century, Francois Maximilien Misson, in a new Voyage to Italy 1714, moderated this opinion, considering that it is a vulgar error that all Jews are black. It is only true of the Portuguese Jews who, marrying always among the other, beget children like themselves. For the 18th and 19th century scientists, the blackness of the Jew was not only a mark of racial inferiority, but also the external manifestation of a disease. The Bavarian writer Johann Pessel, who visited Vienna in the 1780s, described the Viennese Jew as suffering somehow from Jewishness. There are about 500 Jews in Vienna. Their sole and only occupation is to counterfeit, salvage trade in coins, and cheat Christians, Turks, and heathens, indeed themselves. This is only the beggarly filth of Canaan, which can only be exceeded in filth, uncleanliness, stench, disgust, poverty, dishonesty, pushiness, and other things by the trash of the 12 tribes from Galicia, excluding the Indian fakirs. There is no category of supposed human beings which come closer to the orangutan, the orangutan, than does a Polish Jew. Covered from foot to head in filth. Covered from foot to head in filth, dirt and rags, covered in a type of black sack, their necks exposed the color of a black, their faces covered up to the eyes with a beard, which would have given the high priest in the temple chills. Their hair turned and nodded as if they all suffered from the plica paulinica. Beyond skin appearance, among English writers, there was a persistent belief that a hereditary feature transmitted by Jews was their stench, the so-called Foeter Judaicus. For instance, James Howell writes, as likewise that rankish kind of scent, no better indeed than a stink, which is observed to be inherent and inseparable from most of them above all other nations. These exterior diseases of the Jews associated with their unhygienic nature are thus attributed to their moral state and reveal the Jews' very psychology. As late as the 19th century, the medieval humors were still occasionally invoked in their connection. James C. Pritchard commented on the choleric and melancholic constitution of the Jews, which that they usually have a skin color somewhat darker than the English people. And we already know the connection between Ethiopia and England, so of course they would be somewhat darker. For the 18th and 19th century scientists, the blackness of Jew was easily incorporated in the rhetoric of racialism. With specific political implication, the theories of Houston S. Chamberlain categorized the Jews in Foundations of the 19th Century, 1910, as a mongrel race that had hybridized with the Africans while they were exiled in Alexandria. Gilman asserts that by the middle of the 19th century, being black, being Jewish, being diseased, and being ugly came to be inexorably linked. It is therefore not only the color of the skin that enables the scientist to see the Jew as black, but the entire physiognomy. Associated anatomical signs such as the shape of the nose and prognatism supported the assumption of close racial relationship between Jews and Africans. At the end of the 18th century, the Dutch anatomist Petrus Camper analyzed the facial angle and its corollary, the nasal index, which corresponds to the line joining the forehead to the upper lip. The facial angle is calculated by relating this line to a straight line starting from the jawbone. Camper, by defining fairness as corresponding to a facial line with an angle of 100 degrees with the horizontal, connected the African and the Jew through the curve of their noses, considering that both African and Jewish nasal types reveal their inferiority. Around the mid-19th century, Robert Knox shared this analysis and wrote, the African character of the Jew, his muzzle-shaped mouth and face, removing him from certain other races, the eyes long and fine, the outer angles running towards the temples, the brow and nose, apt to form a single convex line, the nose comparatively narrow at the base, the eyes consequently approaching each other, lips very full, mouth projecting, chin small, and the whole physiognomy, when swarthy, as it often is, has an African look. By the end of the 19th century, contradictory theses such as that of Friedrich Ratzel argued that skin color was a matter of geographical differences and could be modified by migrations of populations from one continent to another. Other scientists went back to the previous works of Samuel Stanhope Smith, 1787, president of the University of Princeton, who saw the Jews as a mutant people whose color was everywhere modified by the situation they occupied. In Britain and Germany, they are fair, brown in France, and in Turkey, swarthy in Portugal and Spain, olive in Syria and Chaldea, tawny or copper colored in Arabia and Egypt. Blackness is a common denominator of the inferiority of Africans as well as Jews has a long history in Western culture. It appears as a result of the system of primordial association shared by Christianity and also by Judaism. The racial promiscuity of Jews and Africans became commonplace in the 19th century and came to be adopted as such by some 12th century anthropology, which declared on occasion that Jews were black. All this provided the rationale for the representation of difference and inferiority for both Africans and Jews, whereby the blackness of the Jew represented the synthesis of two projections of otherness according to the same code. Racialism could represent a more or less secularized version of some religious views and stereotypes of Jews and Africans. It could also represent a deliberately secular repudiation of a religious or sentimental account of the unity of mankind or humanity. In both forms, excuse me. In both forms, it contributed to colonial policies throughout the world, as we can see. And we wonder why Hitler was against the Jews. Did it have something to do with the blackness? Well, thanks for tuning in. Give thanks for tuning in to this chapter. Next chapter, we will be delving into the encountering and reinventing the Africans and the Jews in the colonial era, 15th to 19th centuries. More white supremacist minded madness. And our next chapter of the Black Jews of Africa. Give thanks for tuning in. Salam.